Nixon, like I said.
I think that was after he won the election.
No, this is actually this is Nixon literally after he is impeached and he resigns from the office. He gets up, he goes over to the air, I think the helicopter, and he goes. And the big thing here is he's actually not. I guess he's not technically doing the peace signs. It's more of like Nixon would do this thing called like the victory pose with the V. Yeah. You know, it's a V. You're making a V shape and V's in your fingers, but at the same time, peace sign. Everything related to peace is really coming to light in the 70s as well, with like the the whole hippie movement, and then peace sign really kind of being a thing in the 50s and growing onward. But anyways, that's besides the point. The big thing to know with Nixon is that he's got a really weird political career. He wins a close election in 68. As you know, he loses to Kennedy in 60, right? 72, he wins the election in a landslide. Something to keep in mind, 73, all combat troops leave Vietnam. If you remember, that's his big campaigning thing. I want peace with honor, a.k.a. I want to win, so give me some time to win, but if I don't, then I'll pull the troops out, okay? And that's the big thing that people elect him for. Remember, Vietnam is like a huge issue during the time. All these things are going well, and the big thing with Nixon is that he actually has some really decent policies. He's got some pretty progressive policies. He does a lot of work in civil rights initiatives. He does a lot of work with the environment even. He does a lot of things that you and I benefit from even to this day. And it's amazing to see that if you think about Nixon, and if anybody in this room knows anything about Nixon, he is one of the most despised presidents in U.S. history. One of them, right? Not the, but one of them. And he's one of the most controversial presidents in U.S. history. It's really an exercise of him doing, it is not perfect, obviously, but it's really an exercise of him doing, some pretty decent things and then just throwing it all in the garbage. Not his policies necessarily, but his legacy, right? His legacy is definitely tarnished from some of the activities that Nixon has. We'll get to. That's the day. That's the day, check. So, young Nixon, check him out. Here it is. Political career, ups and downs. This is something, you see a lot of politicians have their ups and downs. The current president himself has had his ups and downs. Joe Biden himself has run for president, I think, twice before and lost. Nixon himself was vice president to Eisenhower. He lost to Kennedy in 60. He goes on from losing to Kennedy in 60, remember, it was really close, and he loses the run to become governor in California, which is something that I'm hoping, or I'm guessing that he was hoping, would kind of catapult him to the presidency when he runs again. Now, even though he loses that, some people would look at this, losing a presidential election, losing a governor race, especially after losing such a close presidential election to go on and lose that governor race. Some people would literally just be like, all right, I'm done with politics. And some politicians have retired like that. Nixon, on the other hand, doesn't give up. He's pretty persistent. He comes back. 1968, he has a huge comeback. 8 years later, after kind of making a bigger name for himself in that election campaign against Kennedy, he comes back and he wins the election in 1968. He defeated Hubert Humphrey. What's up? Yeah, sorry. He defeated Hubert Humphrey. If you remember, too, partially, something that has to play here is also just, if you remember last class, the DNC, the Democratic National Convention, is in shambles. Does anybody remember why?
Then Kennedy died.
Mm-hmm. And then, yeah, that as well, right? So you have the whole, also the Battle of Michigan Avenue and all that crazy stuff that's going on. As Sergey mentioned, Robert Kennedy is assassinated after winning the California primary. He would have been a pretty front-running, probably, candidate for the Democratic Party. Instead, they got to go with Hubert Humphrey, which, most of you have probably never heard of, because that's, this is the way it goes. Either you're a famous loser in presidential elections, or you are somebody that most people just don't know about, right? Hubert Humphrey is kind of falling into that category. Wins, I know, right? Sorry, Hubert. Nixon wins, and he has this thing. He calls for a new federalism. This is some of the stuff that we see Nixon say is actually a lot of the stuff that Trump himself also kind of championed during his, run in the presidency. Nixon, just like Trump as well, the spokesperson for the silent majority, right? Talking about looking at the non-shouters, the non-demonstrators. Nixon looking towards the middle America, okay? And the weird thing about this, so remember, Nixon ties to the, obviously the Republican Party. Nixon wants new federalism. He wants to reverse the flow of the power He wants the power to flow from Washington to the states and communities. And that falls in line with a lot of the things that would obviously be championed by the more conservative, probably politicians during the time. Giving more power to the states, giving more powers to the governors, giving more powers to the communities. However, you also have different things like revenue sharing programs, giving money to the states to fund social programs. A lot of like really progressive things that happen under Nixon's presidency. The big thing, you know, the Nixon administration sought to decentralize programs and devolve power to state and locally elected officials. And then much of the initiative targeted federal aid primarily through revenue sharing and block grants. So state and local officials were the principal recipients of this aid. Look at some of the programs. Now, again, it's also interesting to see, even though Nixon, like I said, following in line with more, the more conservative party, he does also expand the government's role, which is not always the thing that you see. Nixon creates things like OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Has anybody ever heard of OSHA? These are the guys that, if you have, shout out to my old boss, if you have somebody who's putting a ladder on top of a ladder at a construction site, literally something that I saw somebody do, there, you might have an OSHA person come around and say, hey, that's an OSHA violation, right? What that means is that you are doing something in the workplace that is not safe. There's this really famous, well, not necessarily famous, I guess one viral video that I've seen where this guy's like recording, he walks up to these construction workers, and there's this guy that's like standing on a beam or something. I don't know if anybody's ever seen this. And the guy that's recording is like, hey, what's he doing on there? And the guys are like, I don't know. And he's like, who are you? And the guy's like, I'm with OSHA. And then like 2 seconds later, the beam like falls. The dude's fine. But like, it's just an example of like unsafe workplaces, and that's the thing that OSHA's targeting. You have water that's dripping on like an electrical socket, and an OSHA inspector comes through and sees that. They probably like shut that down or make sure that you have to fix that. So that's what that's all about, okay? But that is something that increases the size of the government. It increases the size and the role of the government. Nixon also has the Environmental Protection Agency, which he creates. Everybody know about the EPA, right? Have you ever heard of the EPA? Okay, so that, again, so we're seeing OSHA sticking around to this day. We have the EPA sticking around to this day. And there's some other things, too, that we'll see that Nixon does that we still have going on as well. From the EPA's website, the Clean Air Act, this is what they say about it. After the Clean Air Act's first 20 years, in 1990, so 20 years after it is set in place, it prevented more than 200,000 premature deaths, and almost 700,000 cases of chronic bronchitis were avoided. From 1990 to 2010, total emissions of the 6 principal air pollutants decreased by more than 41%, while the GDP increased by more than 64%. Through continued innovation and successful implementation, the Clean Air Act will deliver even more benefits over the next 40 years. So what I'm trying to get across is that it's also interesting to see the contrast between Kennedy and Nixon as well. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not making excuses for the ridiculous stuff that Nixon does that we'll talk about. But at the same time, he does a lot of really good things, but he tarnishes his legacy with the whole Watergate situation. Kennedy, on the other hand, we look at him in the past tense, and it's not that he did like everything terrible or he was a bad president or anything like that, but it's like we almost romanticize one and we look at the other and we demonize them. Now, again, not making excuses. We'll talk about this in just a minute, but it's also important that we look at some of the government programs that Nixon did put forth during his time in the office. He does have his issues. A lot of presidents tend to struggle with the economy. This is always, I feel like we're always talking about how the economy is struggling, right? Or the economy is doing great. The economy is always something in question. Nixon deals with what is called stagflation, which is literally what it sounds like, a combination of stagnation and inflation. Does anybody know what it means to stagnate? Yeah, stop. Like you're going straight, or or you're not dynamic. So this is a dual condition of stagnating economy and inflationary pressures. So the GDP is going down, unemployment's going up. The price of the dollar is going down, right? But things are getting more expensive, which is just a terrible combination, as you might be able to guess. You're not having like all of these cheap goods anymore, and then on top of that, your dollar buys less. Now, I'm no economy expert. That is probably the easiest way that I can explain it. If you have any extra questions about the economy, Mr. Leonard, he's really good at that stuff. So just bother him all you want, okay? But either way, this is what we're experiencing. Corporate earnings are going down. The inflation is going up. And so again, unemployment is also going up as well. People are also out of jobs, which is an additional issue with the economy as well. Like I said, a lot of really progressive things coming out too. We have the Philadelphia plan proposed by Nixon. Labor unions and federal contractors had to submit timetables for hiring minorities. Additionally, we have affirmative action. Affirmative action, again, something that we're still seeing to this day. Special consideration to women and minorities in the fields of education and employment. This is something that you especially see in, like, I don't know, college admissions, right? So there's usually some sort of, not necessarily exceptions, but consideration, as it says there, and maybe even different scholarships, all sorts of things that go into making education, specifically higher education, more accessible for underrepresented or underprivileged groups. Okay, and this is something that Nixon is putting forward. So really, really super progressive stuff. And on top of that, something that sticks around even to this day. So with all that said, let's go ahead and talk about like why Nixon made himself one of the most hated presidents. All those good things, right, or however you look at it, whatever your stance on policy is, all those things, and it all kind of culminates in the Watergate scandal, bringing Nixon down. So this leads to a Senate investigation and televised hearings. Nixon is charged with a cover-up. There is a break-in of a hotel in Washington, D.C. called the Watergate Complex. So, like I said, I'm going to do a little bit more storytelling on this, taking some excerpts from like history.com because they do a better job of kind of crafting a story around this stuff. This is what happens. The Watergate scandal began early in the morning of June 17th, 1972, when several burglars were arrested in the office of the Democratic National Committee, located in the Watergate complex of buildings in Washington, D.C. This was no ordinary robbery. The prowlers were connected to the president, Richard Nixon, and his re-election campaign. They had been caught wiretapping phones and stealing documents. Now remember, 1972, that's an election year, okay? So this is all kind of in part with re-election. It's kind of like cheating, pretty much, right? Looking for sensitive documents, wiretapping, looking for, I don't know, dirt on somebody else, stuff that you can use, okay? Nixon took aggressive steps to cover up the crimes, but when Washington Post reporters Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein revealed his role in the conspiracy, Nixon resigned on August 9th, 1974. Now, the interesting thing about this, too, is that there was actually two break-ins. Because the first time they did it, they messed something up. They broke in again. And they probably would have been able to pull, like, the whole Scooby-Doo, like, I would have gotten away with it thing, right? Except they messed up, like, their wiretaps. So, in May 1972, as evidence would later show, members of Nixon's committee to re-elect the president, it is called the CRP, but it's known as CREEP, probably getting in the fact that yeah, not a lot of people like him at this point, broke into the Democratic National Committee's Watergate headquarters. They stole copies of top-secret documents and bugged the office's phone. So that's the first break-in. The second one is the one that I mentioned last time. The wiretaps failed to work properly. However, so on June 17th, a group of 5 burglars returned to the Watergate building. As the burglars were preparing to break into the office with a new microphone, a security guard noticed someone had taped over several of the building's door locks. The guard called the police, who arrived just in time to catch them red-handed. It was not immediately clear that the burglars were connected to the president. Those suspicions were raised when detectives found copies of the re-election committee's White House phone number along with the burglars' belongings. How suspicious, right? Not the best, sort of cover up in that situation. So the other thing that goes along with this case is just the media, right? The media that follows it. I can't even begin to imagine how excited Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein must have felt. They were basically living in like a spy novel, right? Because they are the two journalists who break this case for the Washington Post. They're two young guys too. This is a huge thing for their careers. I'm sure of it. And then on top of that, I mean, just how insane is it to find yourself breaking a conspiracy involving the President of the United States, especially one like this? They break the case. They follow tips from a secret government informant who is actually a top official of the FBI, Mark Felt. So that's going to play a role too. The FBI's involvement, the CIA's involvement, this whole thing's crazy, right? It's a really, really kind of crazy thing. Those who burglarized the hotel, they had close ties to Nixon's re-election committee, as I said, CRP or CREEP. And additionally, they were paid off by a slush fund. They had a $25,000 payment found in the burglar's account. And this is, a slush fund basically being like, I don't know, when somebody's like, he was paid from a fund that's like across the world overseas in like a Geneva bank or something crazy like that. Okay. What? Yeah, right. So the next big thing that you see is that Nixon actually gets on TV and he's like, hey, the people want to know if their president's a crook. And I am not a crook, right? And then I don't know if there's like the narrator would probably say they're like, yeah, he's a crook. So Nixon. It reminds me of genuinely this situation reminds me very much so later on when Clinton is accused of sexual misconduct. And then he says, I did not have sexual relations with Miss Lewinsky, right? And it's like, everybody's like, well, yeah, you did, right? And then the same thing's kind of happening here with Nixon. People might believe that. And again, like I was saying, it's not like people were like, hey, we hate Nixon all the time or anything like that. There was some backlash, especially with Vietnam. But like I said, some pretty decent policies coming forward. And he's out here basically trying to defend himself. And he's basically going down with the ship, too. Well, let's see about that, okay? Because, he comes out, I'm not a crook. I've not done anything bad. Yeah, well, I don't know about that, because let's take a look at what happens next. So, get this. There's the executive. Now, there's an additional thing that happens, too. Fall of 1973, Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, actually resigns on an unrelated corruption scandal because he's evading his taxes and it's found out, right? So there's already some issues there surrounding the Nixon presidency. Spiro Agnew resigning, unrelated corruption scandal. This is aside from the whole Watergate thing, which is also happening at the same time. Through the 25th Amendment, we have presidential succession, which is where Nixon is nominating Ford to be his new vice president. Ford will later on go to be a president of the United States. Yep. Nixon, it is revealed, it's revealed that Nixon was also secretly taping Oval Office conversations. So a handful of Nixon's aides, including White House counsel John Dean, testified before a grand jury about the president's crimes. They also testified that Nixon had secretly taped every conversation that took place in the Oval Office. If prosecutors could get their hands on those tapes, they would have the proof of the president's guilt. What they're hoping to find is Nixon talking about Watergate, right? Nixon talking about something illegal that he did, and later on we'll talk about whether or not they do. Nixon struggles to protect the tapes during the summer and fall of 1973. His lawyers argued that the president's executive privilege basically gave him the right to keep the tapes to himself. But Judge Sirica and the Senate committee and an independent special prosecutor named Archibald Cox were all determined to obtain them. Nixon refused to turn the tapes over. Eventually, the Supreme Court orders Nixon to turn the tapes over. The longest time he's like holding on to them for his dear life because he knows that he's going to get in trouble if they find out. Eventually, when the Supreme Court comes in, Nixon has no other choice. He has to, right? Not a good look for somebody who's innocent already, by the way. So that is what's happening here. Mr. I'm not a crook. Let's see what happens. Well, Nixon resigns, okay? It's almost like a cop-out, too. Because what happens is they get the tapes. Nixon finally gives up the tapes because he has to, all right? He gives up the tapes, which provided pretty much undeniable evidence of his complicity in the Watergate crimes. In the face of an almost certain impeachment by Congress, Nixon resigned in disgrace on August 8th and left office the following day. What happens is the committee charges Nixon with obstruction of justice, which he said, I didn't do that, right? Abuse of power and contempt of Congress. So lying to Congress, abusing power, obstructing justice. And then the House of Representatives approved to impeach the president, which is basically like, and Nixon resigned. So that's basically like your boss being like, hey, just want to let you know, we're going to have to let you go. And then instead of that, you're like, well, I quit. That's pretty much what happened. All right. Nixon knew that he's going to get impeached, so instead he just resigns. There's other incriminating parts of the Watergate scandal, things like the enemies list, using federal agencies to go after his enemies. So he'd used like the FBI to go after people, right? And then wiretaps placed on telephones, which is obviously a violation of your constitutional rights, without a warrant at least. Here is the famous picture of Nixon. Does this look like the face of somebody who's remorseful?
No.
Yeah, because it's not, right? It's absolutely not. 6 weeks later, and this is the interesting thing, let's take a look at how the American government operates. 6 weeks later, after Vice President Gerald Ford was sworn in as president, he pardoned Nixon for any crimes he had committed while in office. Some of Nixon's aides were not so lucky. They were convicted of very serious offenses and sent to federal prison. Nixon's Attorney General of the United States, John Mitchell, served 19 months for his role in the scandal. Gordon Liddy, known as the Watergate mastermind and a former FBI agent, served 4.5 years. Nixon's Chief of Staff, H.R. Haldeman, spent 19 months in prison, while John Ehrlichman spent 18 months for attempting to cover up the break-in. What do you think Nixon's response was? Well, Nixon goes, I didn't do it, right? But, I dismiss any sort of criminal wrongdoing, but I would say that I probably executed some poor judgment, is basically what he says. Yeah, I used poor judgment, but I am innocent, right? And that is literally the end of it. Nixon goes on, and there's no real repercussions. He's done with politics, right? But at this point, the dude's loaded with money. He's had all the success in his life, and he's just nice, happy retirement, right? He goes and he gets on this helicopter. He does his little victory pose, waves to everybody, leaves to applause, and again, still though, known as one of the most disgraced presidents in U.S. history because of his misconduct. So that is all I have for you guys today. That is the notes. We will do